A warm welcome for the Baloise Art Prize winners 2023, Wai-Kin and Sky Hopinka. Congratulations once again.
It's our turn now. I understand we have to speak English if you forgive us. Yeah. So, well, our two winners. And they have a number of things in common. As we found out in our discussions, they both talk about binaries in their works. And they both are, shall we call it a minority, in the countries they are living. So maybe we focus briefly, we have little time on this. And I would like to ask Wai-Kin a question in this respect. To my surprise, you grew up, say, in Canada. Still, you keep your Chinese name. This is quite unusual because almost all Chinese I know living abroad, they give themselves an English first name. So, are you Chinese? Are you Canadian? Are you none of the above? How would you define your view of where you grew up and of the Chinese culture? Because it appears in the works.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for the question. I think that this is something definitely that I thought about a lot when I was growing up. You know, like, where is my place? Where do I belong? And what I have kind of like realized, and something that I continue to realize through my practice, is a kind of a need to be comfortable between categories, because the reality is that categories are kind of constructed things that we create in order to feel kind of comfortable defining ourselves, so that we can feel settled and solid in one identity or one place. And in the same way that I think that, you know, my experience as somebody who is like mixed race, as well as somebody who's non-binary gender, has really affected the way that I think about the world. I think we all need to be a lot more comfortable existing in between things, because the reality is that nothing is really like black and white or this thing or that thing 100%.
So how about you, Sky? You're a member of the indigenous population, and basically you have been spaced out to very small parts of a territory that was your own at one time. How do you feel? Because in your work, actually you use very American vocabulary as we may know it, not so familiar with indigenous culture. So how do you feel between those two worlds?
It feels like I've always been an Indian, a Native American, indigenous. The world that I live in, America, will never let me forget that. And now I feel that it's important, or have been taught that too, that it's important to explore these different facets of who we are that have been denied us, whether it's our language, our religious beliefs, or even our existence on the landscape that we once called home. And how do we move across these different landscapes? Which is like why in the piece, I mean, the road plays such an important part, because it very much is about moving from one community to another, but also the sort of liminal space that exists on the road, where what happens in a diasporic community or a nomadic community that has no place that they can call home anymore. And it's a very liminal space that I feel like I exist in, and so many other different Native people in the United States and abroad, and other countries around the world that have been affected by colonization. But now how then do we stake claim for our own identities and our own agency in this world that has, for the last 200, 300, 400 years, tried to deny us that?
What we in the jury found was that, as I said, you both deal with very different binaries. And the other aspect we found, you dealt with it in a very subtle way. We are more familiar with works where it's like a right-in-your-face type, description of a binary, while you find a very different language. That really did impress us. And I'm now thinking of a work we were looking at in the jury. It shows you assume another persona, which is a person from Cantonese opera, and you go much further than just assume another persona, like many artists do these days. Mm-hmm. And actually, you point out a binary between, if I remember correctly, your word that representing, or is this person in a dream? Actually, you play this person.
Yes.
And the dream is about a butterfly.
Yes.
And you wake up and you don't really know, am I a butterfly or am I still a person? And so we found you were talking about the space in between these binaries rather than the binary. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that particular work is a depiction of one of my characters that exists in my practice that reappears across different works called the Universe. And the Universe is a character that I use to try to deconstruct the binary of an individual and its context. The work is referencing a work from Chinese art history, Lu Zi's Zhangji, Dreaming of a Butterfly, which depicts a famous allegory, a famous Taoist allegory of a philosopher who falls asleep and has a dream that he's a butterfly that's so vivid. When he wakes up, he's unsure whether he is the philosopher dreaming he's a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming that he's a human. So this is a really beautiful story that talks about the kind of binary of reality and fantasy, which I reference in the work to kind of think about, whose reality are we living in? In my practice, I think a lot about storytelling and how storytelling, the act of storytelling, not only represents but creates reality. And the reality that we live in is actually that we live in many different realities, all kind of coexisting. So the idea is basically that there is a character who exists in this context and actually is a product of the context that he's produced within, and is inseparable from that context. We are a reflection of the context that we exist within, and we are part of that context.
And we also looked at where you assume another persona. Actually, it's Mona Lisa. And it's about news. You call it News of Today.
Yes.
And this is maybe closer to the gender issue because, many art critics are not certain which gender actually Mona Lisa was at the time when conceived. So I thought that is also a very subtle play with a double meaning, the other meaning being news.
Yes.
Because news are also very determined, sowohl als auch, very determined this, but also that. That's what it says, right? Maybe you can say a sentence about that.
Absolutely. So that work depicts a character called the storyteller, who usually exists as a news presenter in my works, kind of defining the narrative from like a box TV. This is a character that I use to think about the role of storytelling in culture. So the character is usually telling opposing narratives and presenting them as equally true. Within this work, I'm referencing the Mona Lisa and the kind of ambiguity of the Mona Lisa's expression to think about a storyteller's intent. But as you were saying, this work is also talking about the creation of objective and subjective knowledge, and how actually these things are often arbitrary, or it depends who is kind of telling the story. It creates this kind of idea of truth. Or false knowledge. And I use these characters, I use this kind of a binary of gender often as a starting point, and then I use it to explore other binaries such as performance and authenticity, and reality and fantasy, and self and other. And I think about how all of these binaries are really intrinsically linked in our culture.
And a question to Sky. In your work, poetry surfaces, of course film, since it's a 4-channel video piece. And are you a filmer? Are you a poet? Are you all of the above? And what is dominating which in your career in general, and now in this piece?
I mean, I like to move between all of those different forms based on the needs of the piece. Like, writing the text first was really helpful, and then determining what we were going to shoot, and being intentional with the camera in these different landscapes with my friends was also very much just about the act of filmmaking. And then how to edit them all together with these texts, with these voices, with these performances. It became a way to really try to contain all these different practices that I try to engage in, that I find really useful to help express the things that are really hard to find words for, or to really explain to others who might not have any sort of familiarity with, like, my background, tribal backgrounds, US, Native American history. And to really connect these different points that are about the things that I'm trying to work through, that I'm trying to process and feel, that's often I don't have words for, or where the sort of didactic, sort of expository tradition of, like, a history lesson doesn't necessarily do that justice, especially based on, like, the active vibrancy of Native communities today.
When it comes to, indigenous people in the US, I think a majority of us, certainly me, we are very ignorant. And can you tell us, has the American culture washed over, the indigenous people and turned them into something else? Or is there still a tradition that is brought from generation to generation that is shaping the indigenous people still with a difference to the ordinary American?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in spite of so many different efforts by the US government, we still exist, and we're still surviving and thriving. And we're very much responding to these histories and to the effects of US policy 100 years ago, 60 years ago, 20 years ago, because it's still part of an active form of resistance to assert our agency and our sovereignty. Like, the piece references NAGPRA, the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which was when it became law that museums had to give back human remains, ancestral remains, to the tribes from which they were stolen, funerary objects. And it's a global issue right now in terms of repatriation. And so this is an active form of how we're surviving and how we're reclaiming these things that have been taken from us, at the same time not letting that define who we are. It's like very much like, there's an active, vibrant communities, Native peoples that are doing so many different things and expressing so many of these different identities. And as there are over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone, there's over 570 different ways to be Native, to be indigenous. And it's not one prescribed idea. And I think that having those different ideas, or it might be like an archipelago, as Glissant describes, or these different sort of relationships of communicating with one another while at the same time maintaining who we are, is very much the practice that I'm interested in through works like this, which are a bit broad and maybe a bit opaque, but also focus on something that is at heart, I think, very human.
Well, I guess we could go on for hours, but we already crossed our time limit. Well, thank you very much. And also would like to thank Baloise. I think it's a great concept, as I experienced in the jury work, and what's the purpose of the art award. First of all, well, we help young artists. Second, it's not that the works just, are acquired and end up in some storage, but actually they're passed on to important institutions. And I have great respect for this concept. Thank you very much.
Thank you.